The horror genre has been an area of media infested by hordes of the cheapest, most exploitative trash ever churned out by humans.
So yeah, I have to look for clues on how to defeat Jeff.
From terribly acted horror flicks that have the camera quality of a 70s snuff film, to any Gmod horror map ever made. But we don't live in the Bronze Age of the early to mid-2000s anymore. We live in the modern age of 2024. From the explosion of independent projects like Mandela Catalog, horror has, in regards to film, reclaimed a bit of its lost glory from the days of truly terrifying films like The Shining or Ring.
Hi, Lloyd.
Skippity rings!
The influence of this unique take on horror isn't just limited to YouTube, however, and has spilled over into the gaming world. Horror games for me are a mixed bag when compared to films. Whereas there are plenty of horror movies I hate and don't find scary,
No!
there are, somewhat inversely, plenty of horror games I can name that I absolutely love, but don't actually scare me. The quality is there, but there's seemingly always something missing. Like Resident Evil 4, it's a great game, but it's not really a horror game, you know? I think for me, what truly makes a scary game isn't gore or loud noises, but instead is the feeling of entrapment, the fear of the unknown, and most of all, the feeling of isolation. The Voyager 1 and 2 probes were a pair of robotic NASA probes launched in 1977. The influence and accomplishments of these missions cannot be understated. They gave us our first in-depth analysis of Jupiter and Saturn, the first detailed appearances of their moons, and our first and only close-up pictures of Uranus and Neptune. To quote Voyager's lead project scientist, Edward Stone, "When I look back, I realize how little we actually knew about the solar system before Voyager. We discovered things we didn't know could be discovered, time after time." Now, naturally, considering the fact it took 12 years for one of the probes to reach Neptune and neither were ever designed to fly back, the small and light size of the crafts themselves, and that the technology didn't exist yet to facilitate anything else, Voyager was entirely helmed by mission control. No humans were ever considered to be brought aboard the Voyager probes, and it was, by design, an entirely unmanned mission. But what if it wasn't? To be honest, I couldn't think of a more horrifying idea. Being crammed into one small, claustrophobic cabin grafted somewhere onto the probe, silently coasting through the vast to nothing, with massive, scary-looking planets of churning gas being the only thing to interrupt the journey every few years or so. Only at the end of the mission for the astronaut to be assured that they were never meant to return. With no point left in living, all they could do is continue to lay in what is essentially their tomb, lost forever, floating through the void, alone. That is, basically, the premise to Voyager-19. A game where you play as an astronaut sealed into a small space probe and sent off to scout out neighboring solar systems over the course of several decades. If that premise sounds somewhat familiar, that's probably because Voyager-19 is heavily inspired by another indie cosmic horror title, Iron Lung. Now, that game probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Its story has been covered and weeded through all the hell on YouTube, to the point where even Markiplier picked the game up for like a show or film deal or something.
295 confirmed beautiful.
But to sum up, the story of the game involves a convict, you the player, being sealed into an ad hoc built submarine to explore a barren moon filled with an ocean of blood. This, after all known stars, planets, and planetary life in the Milky Way galaxy have suddenly vanished. Voyager-19 even shares much in common with Iron Lung in terms of gameplay, like its navigational mechanics and placing heavy emphasis on photographing your surroundings. However, even despite the shared setting of outer space and the similar gameplay, Voyager has plenty about it to set it totally apart and is still a very unique horror game, and is probably one of the scariest games I've ever played, up there with the likes of Silent Hill 1 and the Five Nights at Wario's trilogy.
You want fun? Why, I'll show you fun. What the hell is that?
The official goal of this mission is to search for habitable planets in the Okrulu sector, but your real mission is to figure out what happened to the Magellan science expedition that went missing there. The public is unaware that they've deviated from their original course and cut communications. We need to know what happened before it gets publicized. We've provided you a Voyager-19 series spacecraft. It's basic, but has hibernation tech and fractional light speed capable engines. The electronics are the main limitation. Radiation will degrade them on interstellar flights, but they will remain functional for the 7 missions we've commissioned you for. This bit of opening exposition is the main setup to Voyager's plot, and it's amazing just how little we're told and how much is implied. It's clear that humanity has achieved the technology to explore space in a practical fashion, to the point where missions to discover habitable exoplanets are already underway, and certain regions of space have already been scoped out, labeled, and given boundaries on charts. And the loss of Magella was seemingly so unexpected and costly that, in a panic, they hurriedly commissioned your character out with the vague and open-ended objective of locating the lost expedition, and stuff you in a bare-bones and presumably antiquated craft that is guaranteed to degrade over time. One thing I really enjoy about the game is the name and appearance of the Voyager-19 itself, clearly taking inspiration from the actual pair of Voyager probes. I assume this is an alternate reality where the success of Voyager was further capitalized on, with the spacecraft becoming a series of varying models handling multiple missions post-1989. Yeah, wouldn't that have been something? With a minimal briefing and not knowing what exactly is waiting to be found, you're placed into hibernation and guided in the direction of the first star system. Light years away from any human form of life, there are no words over a speaker giving you some final bits of advice or perspective on how to achieve your mission. No chance for help if something goes wrong. You simply wake up totally alone in silence and have to get hold of your bearings. While your character is free to look around, it's not possible for you to actually move. You're constantly placed in this uncomfortable-looking upright position with tubes connected to you for breathing that splay out all over your tiny cabin. It's also somewhat brutal and concerning to think that the only thing between you and being sucked out into the vacuum of space are these somewhat standard sheet metal walls. The only thing between you and being lost to space or coming face to face with these massive strange planets is the small cabin of a primitive space probe. It's also a largely empty cabin. Aside from life support equipment, there's also a single computer terminal where all aspects of spacecraft control can be accessed, and where basically all the gameplay can be found. There are 5 different menus you can access through the terminal, although the 3 you'll switch between the most are navigation, sensors, and power. Navigation is what you'd expect to find, a simple pixel grid map of the solar system you're present in, and where you can plot your courses for traveling within it. Sensors are where you record planetary data, and can find the controls for rotating your probe's orientation. Power is also very self-explanatory to anyone who's ever played a FNAF game. Official or fan-made, don't worry. All the previous systems mentioned, your camera, radio, thrusters, nav, they all have their own dedicated power switches. But also, you have your life support switch, which naturally essentially always needs to be switched on. Early on, this isn't really something to worry about, but this will become more relevant later. It all seems very simple, and to be fair, it is, but navigating solar systems is actually somewhat tricky to pin down at first. First off, I think it's worth noting that, again, similar to Iron Lung, you aren't just placed into a stationary environment that generates JPEGs on a screen whenever you take a photograph. You're actually in full control of a camera, navigating around a 3D space. Planets themselves are also real objects that rotate like a planet, generate radio waves within a certain radius, and can also be photographed from afar, which means you can snap a series of approach pictures similar to a real-life spacecraft. I mean, doing that serves no real practical purpose. The game will tell you pictures taken from too far are no good. But, you know, it's kinda cool if you're a big space nerd. At the center of each solar system, you have a star, of course, sometimes even a binary pair of them. And just like real life, the face of a planet that faces its star will be illuminated, and the far side will be dark. So, you have to approach planets at specific angles to be able to snap usable pictures. If there's too much darkness, it's discarded. When a picture you take has been deemed acceptable for processing, that's when you can move on to recording a planet's radio emissions. For anyone who has astrophobia or some kind of fear of outer space, this is probably the part of the game that will get to you the most. For me personally, the sounds of celestial objects is, in particular, probably one of the most disconcerting aspects about space. We like to think of space as an always quiet, empty void, but with the proper equipment, it's actually a very noisy place. Sometimes eerily noisy. I also like how Voyager-19 recycles real-life recordings and mixes them together with other sounds to create unique planetary sounds. Without a doubt, I definitely heard the sounds of Jupiter and Saturn and even the Sun thrown in there. You can even pick up whispers of emissions if you turn your radio on in the middle of empty space. It creates this perfect atmosphere that is both lonely and nerve-wracking, but also one that feels scientifically grounded. It feels like a scenario someone could actually find themselves in if we ever actually reach the technological level to facilitate such a brash mission. An element that I feel is lacking for many sci-fi horror games. Like, yeah, shooting zombies in space is fun and all, and call me a prude all you want, but I can't really suspend my disbelief enough to be scared by anything that's thrown at me in that kind of league of game.
Without the bullets, I cannot kill. Tear.
Homosexual.
Once a system is fully surveyed, you can enter hibernation and travel to the next system. The first couple of solar systems are pretty normal. There's nothing anomalous or strange to report. There are only planets, barren or gaseous, to report. It isn't until the third system that things begin to take a downward spiral. Because, you know, the funny horror rule of three trope. By now, as your mission statement claimed it would, your probe is beginning to die. Not to a catastrophic level by any means, but still. Your probe's control monitor is starting to corrupt, and your power is beginning to drain. Whereas before you could have all systems powered up at once, you'll now have to make do with having one area of ship control powered off at a time. While for now it's manageable, it's no doubt a bad sign of things to come. After quickly collecting data on the system's star, you start to set a course for the first planet, only for the chart to list it as Magella Vessel, the primary and classified objective of your mission. Not knowing what it is you might find, you immediately begin to navigate your way to the listed location, only to encounter the game's one and only jump scare. Oh, Jesus. Man, that was cheap. After finally making your approach to the spacecraft, the worst possible discovery is made that there's basically nothing left of the ship to salvage. It's not just simply disabled or dead, it's a complete wreckage, the crew having been dead for years. Turning on your radio, however, you discover the ship is still transmitting out into space. This transmission turning out to be the encrypted history of the ship's logs, each log requiring years worth of time to decrypt. Couldn't be me. 8 gigabytes of RAM have an ass. But it's not like that long wait time is much of an obstacle for you, considering you still have 4 more systems to survey after your departure from the wreckage. Wrapping up the final planet for System 3, you enter hibernation and travel to System 4. Upon revival, the first encrypted log from the Magella is ready to be read and transmitted back to your superiors, titled Ship_log. Anomaly detected in System LK. Exploration target planet LK2, potentially habitable, does not exist. Report error in astronomical data to Exploration Committee. Similarly to your own mission statement, the mission of the Magella explains so much, yet so little at the same time. But I think it's safe to say that unlike you, however, the crew of the Magella weren't dispatched with any off-the-book objectives. This wasn't a black op. The crew of the Magella had the legitimate goal of scouting out a planet previously deemed habitable. For now, despite whatever confusion you might have, it's best to focus on wrapping up your surveillance ASAP before your increasingly diminishing power finally goes kaput. System 4, however, only raises more questions when you arrive at Object PL2. Whatever that is, it's not a planet. Although it's spherical like one, and it rotates like one, it gives off no radio signals, and, you know, it also has giant holes in it, and appears to be more like a shell-type object. And, planets don't really tend to be hole-filled shells. When I initially saw PL2, my first thought was that of a Dyson sphere. In case you don't know, a Dyson sphere is a theoretical megastructure that would partially, or entirely encase a star. in order to utilize the majority of its energy output. Although it's not something humanity is yet capable of, it is theoretically possible, and interestingly enough, there are candidate stars we've observed that may have something like a Dyson sphere being present around them. But if that really is what PL2 is meant to be, why has it seemingly been abandoned and left to float out in the middle of space, far off from its host star, unless it's not actually a Dyson sphere at all, and is something different? Waking up in System 5, another decrypted file is ready to be read. This time, a personal entry from one of the crew, titled Journal_entry.
Certain physical principles hold true across massive size differences and create illusions of similarity. A cell looks like a star in a supernova. Our eyes like a nebula. What if these similarities apply to life at different scales as well?
This message at first glance doesn't appear to have much meaning, and comes off more as the mad ramblings of a scientist lost in space for too long. So what more can you do but move on to decrypting the next entry, and continuing your mission? At this point in time, the Voyager probe is beginning to break down pretty badly. Power can only be directed to 3 out of 5 of the probe's systems, and the monitor's corruption is making text harder to read. At this point, I think it's safe to say that all certainty is gone, and home is nothing more than a distant memory for the main character. There's almost this feeling that you're becoming more and more lost with every picture and eerie recording that you take, a feeling only amplified by Object FD2. It's another one of those shell-like objects, only this time it's actually emitting sounds. A heartbeat. Their journal entry from before is now starting to sound like more than just mad ramblings from a lost scientist. Could it be you're staring at an image of the first life beyond Earth? If so, how could it survive the nothingness of space? And what is it?
These predators may mimic food or sexual partners to lure in their prey. One example is the snapping turtle, whose tongue resembles a worm it can wiggle around. When fish attempt to eat it, they will instead be eaten by the turtle. Another form of aggressive mockery is found in it.
Reading this next log entry only calls into question whatever was discovered by the crew of the Magella, the questioning of the scale of life, and the noted behavior of cunning predators despite being out in the middle of space. It must be related to those shell-like objects you keep coming across. Whatever they are, they're no doubt alive. Something only confirmed around planet ZW2. It's almost as if you're being stalked. You're an unwanted visitor around this star, and you need to get away from this nest you've unknowingly stumbled into. After coming across yet another shell that I swear to God looks like it turns to face the player, System 6 is completely surveyed, and the final star can be traveled to. After this last star system, you'll have finally earned your trip home. The final log recovered from the Magella is easily the most unsettling of them. It appears to be a chat between members of the ship's crew not long before their disappearance, and just after they lost contact with Earth.
He's changed our course and disabled the comms system.
Right, so the committee can't remotely override our route when they find out.
This is dangerous. The ship is designed to last 60 years, but with the route he wants, we'll be out here for almost 100.
Honestly, at this point, you're not much better off than that long-forsaken crew. At this point, your Voyager-19 is borderline dead. There's only enough power to keep 2 systems going at a time. Your screen is borderline totally scrambled, and the wait time to enter and exit menus can take upwards of 2 seconds. Power management is at its absolute most frugal. Navigation, maneuvering, and data recording all need to be done individually. This can, of course, be partially aided if you edge your life support a bit, but that's somewhat risky as your character is such a lightweight that he just outright dies after like 20 seconds without excess oxygen. And also there's an ear-piercing alarm blaring, just as a friendly reminder that, hey, you turned your air off, retard. Your dying probe makes the surveillance of System 7 slow down to a crawling speed. only making it more uneasy to discover it's exclusively populated by more of those shell creatures. Only they don't look very shell-like anymore. They appear fuller, more porous than they do open, as if they're growing or gestating somehow. That is, of course, until you reach the final object in the solar system, SC3. Oh, is this an SCP reference? Go! As you make your approach and it becomes larger in the camera, and despite the corrupted feed, the telltale blue and green colors of what looks like an Earth-like planet are easy to spot. But there was never any indication given to you by your superiors that such a planet was ever charted along your course. But the suspicions are only confirmed as you enter the planet's orbit. Continents, clouds, water oceans, it's all there. It looks like home. It may even just be safer to land here than attempt a journey back to Earth with how badly your probe has been abused. It looks like you're finally safe. That is, of course, until you tune into your radio. You're not home, and you're far from safe. And as you take one last photo, it's not possible to escape, try as you might. You're ensnared, and all you can do is continue to snap photos of what is just outside your probe, moving closer and closer, until, after a moment of silence, your mission comes to an end. Ultimately, the flight of the Voyager-19 raised more questions than it did answers. While the lost Magella craft was partially recovered, logs acquired revealed little about its ultimate fate, and nothing can really be discerned about the creatures that stalked and ultimately destroyed your probe. Report: Voyager-19 craft has failed to establish communications. Losses cannot be hidden from the public any longer. Recommend waiting until election cycle is over to announce. And that's it, you've beaten the game. Voyager-19, as you can tell, is not a very big game. It takes maybe an hour to finish on your first playthrough if you really take your time to explore a bit. And to be honest, I will admit, there's basically no replay value at all. But overall, Voyager-19 I think is an excellent little experiment in cosmic horror. And looking at the Steam page, most people who've played seem to be in agreement. Although there are a fair amount of negative reviews of varying amount of quality and fairness. In my opinion, however, what Voyager pulls off is pretty effective at unnerving anyone with even a slight fear of space. And while, yeah, the comparisons to Irelung can be made, along with Irelung, I think it's pretty amazing how such tiny games can be effective at creating such great horrific atmospheres and telling very off-putting stories. And while little of Voyager-19's story is outright explained to the player, it's somewhat simple to stitch together. Now, if you ask me, I think the catalyst that started the whole game to begin with is what ultimately ends it: the creature that mimics the Earth-like planet. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't believe there was any nefarious intent behind the mission of the Magella craft. I really think it was legitimately dispatched to survey an Earth-like exoplanet discovered back home. Now, there are instances in real life where a planet initially thought to be habitable is later deemed uninhabitable by new data. I mean, humanity at large even used to believe planets like Mars and Venus used to be places that were likely inhabited by living beings. But the crew of the Magella didn't just discover the data was wrong or misinterpreted. They discovered empty space. The planet observed from Earth just doesn't exist, period. It was there, and now it isn't.
Such is life in the... fuck it.
I fully believe that what was discovered was the Mimic, and in between the time of Magella leaving Earth, arriving at the desired solar system, and the crew going AWOL for unknown reasons, the Mimic migrated to another star. A migration that no doubt takes a long time to travel, sure, but that doesn't make much difference when you consider how long it takes for probes to travel between stars. Even if they travel at, say, 40% the speed of light, that's still decades worth of time it takes to travel from one star to another. I mean, when you really think about it, the administration you and all other astronauts report back to between hibernation sessions is a completely different one each time, but I think one thing that stays the same between each one is what they don't tell you. I firmly believe you were never meant to come home. You were always meant to die up there. Something I think provable by the rapid deterioration of your craft. The organization who sent you to space knew there was something anomalous, or possibly alive in space, that preyed on humanity's probes. Something large that was very obviously migrating, almost intelligently. But that's basically all they knew. I also think they knew that the Magella was destroyed by these creatures, given the contents of the craft's logs, and given that these creatures seem to understand what you are. The recovery of the Magella, the planetary surveying, all of it was a front to hide the truth from you, to keep you wandering the stars long enough until you eventually encountered what they were truly after. If you never found anything, well, at least you surveyed some planets. If you did find something, great. Now either go ahead and kill yourself, or let your probe die and drift aimlessly for billions of years. Your bait, cast out into the cosmos, or the scientists safe on Earth. But what even are the things you're luring? Voyager-19 plays into a very niche fear known as astrophobia, the fear of large objects and structures in space. Examples of this being Ton 618, one of the largest known black holes, or, say, galaxy filaments, the largest structures to occur within the observable universe. Normally, things like planets don't fit into this sphere, but something living, the size of a planet, that's a completely different story. The concept of a living planet isn't something new to sci-fi, or even sci-fi horror. I mean, just look at Local 58, an early analog horror series that partially revolves around the concept of the moon being a living entity. While it may be partially coincidental, I think the corner of space you're tasked with surveying is a nest of sorts, an area where these living planets are initially birthed and grow into themselves. And these shell-likes you encounter throughout the game are embryos of sorts, with the first one you come across without a heartbeat being a stillborn, or maybe it starved to death. Now, I have no fucking idea at all how a being the size of a planet is born, much less what it eats. But I can definitely guess how a fully grown one of them does eat. The comparisons to mimicry behavior by the lost crew, the outward earthly appearance, these things aren't like plants and feast off of starlight. They're predators who use their habitable appearance to lure in us. Us in this context not meaning exclusively humans, but any life form that becomes spacefaring. It reminds me almost of the glowworm, a type of bioluminescent larva that sticks to the walls and ceilings of caves in large groups, using their collective light to mimic starlight. In doing so, it lures other bugs to fly towards them, thinking they're heading into the open sky, only to then be ensnared by the larvae and devoured. It's not uncommon for sci-fi stories to parallel this concept, and to be fair, who knows if it's really something that's true or not. We, the spacefaring humans, are the fluttering insects. The planet that ensnares the Voyager-19 is the glowworm. And just how space serves as our cave ceiling, there are likely many more of these planets out there, lying in wait, starving, eager to fool us with what looks like seas and lush landscapes, getting us closer to them until they feel confident enough to strike.